Hey there, it's Khali here from Tribe. I'm feeling pretty tired at the moment. I've had a bit of an emotional day. Particularly the first half of today I felt quite heavy and overwhelmed and just like not coping that well with the demands coming at me, largely being parenting demands and just like spending time with my kids. And found it hard, and sometimes I have these types of days, and even though having done like a whole heap of work on myself, at times I still go into states where I'm feeling heavy, and I feel a lot of compassion for myself in this place, and for all of us really, when we go into these places that are emotionally heavy and maybe a bit confusing. And so some of my interpretation of what's been going on for me is just that I've had my kids for an extended period. My ex-wife is currently overseas, and so I've like had an extended stint of looking after my kids, and that I'm basically just needing a little bit of time to myself, just a bit of space to like be with me and have some self-connection. Prem, in her Attachment Theory Live, I see that Prem's actually watching, nice. The other night was talking about kind of different attachment styles, and I totally relate to the attachment style kind of having come from more of a sense of being enmeshed with my mum in particular, that would have me kind of looking after her needs more than mine, and at times it being kind of risky to have needs and take up space, and kind of instead my attention being way more on just like the needs of people around me, and then that resulting, as I think Prem beautifully articulated, in me, like at times kind of not actually speaking my needs and making the kind of requests and just taking what I needed to until it was like so loud in my awareness that it kind of comes out a bit aggressively, and this is a pattern that I find myself in today still, that I'm still figuring this pattern out. And so, so part of my interpretation is there's this piece of needing some space and needing kind of some self-connection and implies just kind of some rest as well, and me catching it a little bit late. And then kind of from that place of my needs not being satisfied, I'm also just like overwhelmed, like it's like I'm not actually, my resources to cope with things being thrown at me aren't there as much as they would be if I had kind of given myself these needs, and then of course from that place, anything coming at me is just like really hard because I'm just like not resource for it, and there's like place of like me just like collapsing under it, just like feeling just really tight in it, and everything just like feels really hard, and had me feeling kind of grumpy and just like super irritable. So today I finally got my kids out of the house. We watched a couple of superhero cartoons. That was like kind of some nice escapism. So that was a way of me just like, let's do something which has me like somehow coping. Basically, this is like a pretty strong pattern for me, a coping strategy is like just escape. And I spoke a little bit about this in the last Facebook live I did around kind of some of my avoidance patterns. But we finally got out of the house and we went to a park, and my kids were like pretty happy playing in this park. There were like rocks to climb on, which was really awesome because it gave me a bit of space to just like be with myself and just like take some breaths and breathe and feel myself and reflect on what I'd been feeling, and from this place of reflection, I came more into contact with just essentially kind of what's important for me, or what that I want to actually feel upright, and I want to feel a sense of love and solidity and kind of positivity and kind of direction in terms of like just how I'm holding what's going on for me, and so from this place of self-connection, then arose more sense of cultivating emotions that are important for me, these kind of positive style emotions. So what I've just described in all of this, to me, is like a really interesting description of some of the intricacies of emotion. And emotion generally is something that I've been fascinated with for a very long time, you know, and I'm still kind of making sense of how I work emotionally and how like emotions work generally. And of course, like emotions, you know, essentially are the states that we're in, you know, and we're always in some kind of state. And at the most base level, it's just kind of a physiological state. And we could say there's like an affective state, an emotional, which on top of is kind of feelings and then emotions. And then we start to get more into kind of cognitive layers of ourselves. But of course, like states are the foundations of our behavior. It's like the state that we're in is what has us interpreting our surroundings. It's like swimming in a particular emotional state will have us, you know, responding based on that state, and then like how we're like seeing what's going on, so how we're interpreting things will come out of that state, and then consequently also our behavior will also come out of that state. You know, so having an ability to kind of understand these emotional states and cultivate them is then also the foundation of what has us actually being powerful in the world, right? And ever since I, from a very young age, got into personal development, you know, that had me very interested in like, well, you know, what is it to understand my states and be able to cultivate different states, you know, understand my emotions and be able to cultivate different emotions. You know, so I think that's probably the main thing that started this inquiry off for me for a very young age, right? So I want to like speak to some of the intricacies within the scenario that I just talked about. So, and some of this, you know, I'm already starting to talk a little bit about like why is emotion actually important, but I want to even kind of dive into that more. So this first piece that I've just talked about, you know, the emotions are the states that we operate out of. Okay, so that's one major reason why emotion's important, because that's actually what's going to have us showing up in our lives in all the different kind of ways that we show up, and how do we actually want to show up, right? Another, I think, really important angle of, you know, the importance of emotion is how emotions essentially is the kind of messenger for what our needs are, right? So in this example that I was giving, you know, what I felt today, you know, and if I was like more attuned in the previous days, and this is kind of what I want to keep getting better, it would like let me know that, actually I'm needing, you know, to take time for myself. I'm needing space for self-connection. I'm needing rest to kind of be resourced to myself. You know, so to me, the more that we can learn to listen to the messages in our emotions, they become this really valuable sources of information and insight about ourselves and about what's important to us and how we're actually going, you know, and both from our most kind of basic needs of like, you know, food and security, sleep and so on, to our kind of higher order needs, you know, our needs for meaning in life and our needs for belonging and friendship and growth and contribution. So on. So that's kind of another angle. So I've got this kind of couple of angles. One is like emotions as states, emotions as messages and sources of like things that inform us. Now there's also a kind of an extra piece on top of this, kind of the messages of which emotions inform us, which is how emotions actually are part of like the shape of who we are, right? So there's you know, what I've just been describing about my emotions, in a sense, it's like messages around what's happening for me at the moment, you know, whether I'm like tired and, you know, needing space for myself and so on. But I think there's also this piece where, you know, I've been shaped in a particular way based on particularly my early childhood years, which have formed who I am. You know, and we're kind of in our early years, you know, baby in the first couple of years, we're just like raw patterning machines in a sense, you know, we're just like so open, and all the stimulus that's coming in towards us, we're just like patterning completely in response to that stimulus, you know, and basically learning how to be in response to that particular stimulus, and particularly, like as Prem was speaking to in the last live a couple of days ago, particularly around how we're in relation to our primary caregiver, what our kind of security is to our primary caregiver. So that patterning essentially it's implicit memory. It's a type of memory that's not kind of verbal. It doesn't have language associated with it. It's just like built into the very nature of my being itself, right? So if there's any kind of stimulus like that stimulus in which I've been patterned around, I am going to move as I moved in the initial patterning associated with that stimulus, right? So from an attachment point of view, if somebody moves away from me, and it had me feel a particular way, and those feelings weren't kind of responded to, in a way that had me feel secure, then I will start feeling insecure when that type of thing happens. If someone isn't attentive to me in a particular way, I'm going to start feeling abandoned. I'm going to start feeling hurt, isolated. So some of what I described in this scenario, like what I've been feeling this morning, to me is representative of my implicit memory of this early patterning that I've gone through, right? And I'm still making sense of exactly what that is. Implicit memory, being implicit means that it's like a lot of it's like pre-verbal. It doesn't have like a lot of cognition that I've have awareness around, so I've got to like take the time to actually unpack the kind of make sense of what does that actually mean to me. And so some of my own sense making, which I shared before around some of this, is just like some of how in my early childhood, there was periods where there wasn't a lot of stability, there was a lot of like high intense emotion around me. There was kind of a lot of anxiety and fear, and it kind of imprinted me with this kind of that kind of sense where I had needed to be quite vigilant, have my attention out to have, keep myself safe, so that, and then that meant that I didn't necessarily have so much awareness of like being, connected to myself and what I'm needing, and a sense of like having secure base to really rest in, such that any kind of high intensity doesn't perturb me so much. I can be quite thrown around if there's like quite a bit of intensity, and this to me is then what starts to happen with my kids, of kind of constantly throwing things at me, and it kind of gets to a certain threshold, and I just like start to not cope. So an example like this, where I've been basically patterned in response to a particular stimulus, means that some of my emotions, essentially, they're maladaptive. They're not adaptive to the situation. Like what would actually be more adaptive, is emotions that would just like have me more aware of my needs, or kind of have me more resilient in myself, and having a stronger sense of stability in myself. So this is then the other kind of really interesting piece of what emotions tell us. They tell us about our history, right? A lot of our emotions are historical. They're telling us about how we've been patterned, the formation of who we actually are and how we actually work. And this is kind of the harder aspect of emotions, I think, a lot of the time. And requires, I think, quite a bit of introspection and self-reflection and therapy, and working on ourselves, looking inside to kind of understand this implicit patterning that we have. So I realise I'm like throwing quite a bit in here. There's quite a bit of complexity going on, but I'm like enjoying my own process of like speaking to it and making sense of it. So I'm gonna just like add a few more pieces. So going back to my scenario today, right? So when I'm at the park and I've finally got some space to myself, and I'm kind of reflecting on how I'm going, and that space to myself is letting me kind of basically soothe myself and kind of calm down, start to like make more sense of some of emotionally what's going on for me. Some of it is me hearing my own needs and starting to actually have some of those needs met. Some of it is making sense of actually my own history, you know, so some of my early patterning, you know, and kind of basically kind of parenting myself a little bit, you know, around some of that, you know, kind of giving myself compassion around those things, kind of hearing some of those voices that kind of had me just like feel scared, and kind of like having emotion disproportionate to actually what's happened, and kind of just like self-soothing around some of those things. And of course doing that is then helps me very gradually. To me, this is a gradual process of like repatterning myself over time, you know, understanding more deeply what happens for me when there is this particular type of stimulus that comes in, and as I start to make sense of that, I can start to have kind of more choice and understand how to relate to myself more when those things start to come up. And then in the example that I shared, I talked about how you know, as I came into this kind of place of being more spacious and self-connected, I came into connection with more of my own kind of positive emotions, you know, emotions that I want to cultivate. And of course, that is an emotion in and of itself, you know, so this is really interesting to me as well, that it's like actually our emotions that kind of change our emotions. You know, it was me starting to connect with this sense of wanting to be more solid and more loving, and you know, and feeling the depth of my heart in that kind of place. You know, that's kind of an emotional place. You know, it's kind of coming out of my own emotions of self-compassion and kind of spaciousness and peacefulness that actually then helped me start to shift my own state. So we've got quite a few things going on here, just like one or two more pieces. So I've talked quite a bit about why emotions are important. The second part of the title that I put for this Facebook Live is, well, I know how to change my emotions, and should I, right? So I'm now starting to shift into more of like, how do I actually change my emotions? So one aspect of this is actually what I've just been talking about, like making sense of what's actually going on for me, connecting in with other emotions which are going to help me change these emotions. And then this is part of what I ended up doing today is because I know some of the fundamentals of what will change my state. You know, there's some like really easy basic stuff which I think is so empowering for all of us to know. This stuff I really want to teach my kids, and I think we should be teaching it in our schools generally. So some really simple things I know that I can do to change my state. One is, what do I choose to focus on? Like, am I choosing to focus on, you know, all the kind of negativity and tightness that I'm feeling around this stimulus, or am I choosing to focus on, you know, in my case today, I was like sitting in a beautiful spot and looking out over the water and just like seeing the kind of vastness of the water and the sky and nature. So just focusing on nature and how it makes me feel, and focusing on what's important to me, you know, and what I love. You know, to me that's like one of the simplest things I can do to shift my state. Knowing about my own physiology, I think, is another really powerful thing to shift my state. So we've talked quite a bit on these lives about embodiment. So being aware of what I'm actually doing in my body to create the emotions that I'm feeling. And of course the emotions, quite often, you know, emotions kind of happen to us in that I didn't choose to feel how I was feeling. It just kind of occurred to me. It was like below my threshold of consciousness. I didn't control it. But in the process of those things happening to me, it created a particular physiology. You know, there was kind of a collapse and a tightness and I felt a lot in my gut. You know, and so seeing those things and coming into connection with what's going on in my physiology then also gives me the choice to shift those things. So a big part of what I practiced today was actually just coming into more uprightness, you know, feeling my sense of verticality, connecting into that sense of what's important to me, which, you know, to me, there's an embodiment of verticality as part of that, but also there's a kind of certain width and a solidity. So I feel on my body more of my belly, I can feel my feet on my ground, just like more of a sense of kind of a pillar in my way of being. And then of course I can pay attention to my language and what's going on with my thoughts, you know. So these, and I'm not going to go fully into that But these three things, I think, what we focus on, what we pay attention to, what we're doing in our physiology, and what we're doing in our language. And this is a model I've actually taken from Anthony Robbins. It's a simple one that I really like. Are just like such direct ways to shift our states, and like I was saying, how we see things and the behaviors that we enact come from our states. So it's like so empowering to know how to shift our states. So this is a part of what I started to doing today, is just like working at shifting my state, by paying attention to these things. So that the final piece that I put in the title here, like, okay, so I know how to shift my state, I know how to change what I feel, but should I? And this is a really interesting question to me. And when I first started exploring kind of these ways to shift state, I do it all the time. It was like, wow, I can do this thing. It's just like, it's so empowering. But what I've like gradually learned over the years is that if I do this in a way where I'm not actually really listening to the emotion, it essentially becomes a form of bypassing. It becomes a form of disassociation, right? So I could choose to shift my state in a way where I'm like kind of doing this to the state that I'm in. I'm like, oh my God, this is like, feels really bad. It sucks. I'm just going to push it away by like choosing to shift my physiology and pay attention to different things, right? But by doing so, I start to lose actually the really valuable information in those emotions, right? So of course, like listening to that, like, this is like the start of the live is like so important. This is where I can hear what my needs are, and I can understand some of my early patterning, and by understanding that patterning, I actually start to shift it, and I start to understand how I move in response to a particular stimulus, and develop more sophisticated and ways of responding to that stimulus. And there's also this kind of way in which if I listen to these things, the emotion is going to like, it's going to just move, I'm going to like move through it. It's like, to me, emotion gets stuck when we resist it somehow. So if I don't resist it and I can actually hear it and let it move in my being, and then I can just kind of move with it and let it pass through. And there's a whole bunch of like really, I think, great modalities for releasing emotion. A lot of them, to me, it's actually about embracing the emotion. It's about welcoming it, right? It's not trying to change it. It's actually just letting it be there more in a way, which I think is really, really important, right? So, there's kind of like a polarity here of like how to respond to emotion. There's like, on one side of it's the listening and allowing emotion to move through me and kind of find its natural expression, and hear the needs in the emotion and kind of respond to those needs, And then on the other side is this kind of more masculine approach of, well, I can just choose to feel something different. I can shift my state based on whatever the physiology of what I'm focusing on, and then I'm just going to choose to be in states that feel really good to me. And so when there's like these two choices, like how do we actually know which choice to follow? Like, should I really just like be in the emotion and welcome it and allow it to move through me, or should I choose to shift it or not? And to me, this is like a really deep and important question, and I don't think it has like a black and white kind of answer. What should I do in this particular situation? And to me, a lot of the answer is just like about asking yourselves the question, is this something I want to be feeling right now? Is it something important for me to be feeling in this? And sometimes I'll ask myself that question, and it could even be that I'm feeling depressed, right? And sometimes like the answer for me is like, actually, I do want to be feeling this. I don't want to shift my state. And in those situations, I'll actually like start enjoying feeling what I'm feeling, So like if I'm feeling depressed and heavy, do I want to be feeling this? I'll like be like, yeah, I do want to be feeling this. Like I'm gonna feel depressed. I'm just gonna like do it all out. Like, yeah, it's gonna be heavy and feels like shit. And yes, it's kind of starts being in this enjoyable experience in a really paradoxical way, because I can actually like, it's a choice. It's become a choice. I'm not had by it so much. I'm choosing to actually be in that kind of place. And then the other part of that, I think, is, have we actually heard the message? So do I want to be feeling this thing? And do I understand it? Do I understand what it's telling me? You know, is there a need that I need to be hearing? You know, is there something, you know, from my early childhood that's kind of, you know, needs to be heard as well? Is there some compassion or some grief, you know, that needs to be released? So if I do have a sense of like what's going on there, and I can kind of start to make meaning out of it, well, then there's going to be, to me, a lot more sense of like ease, and there's like a more relief in a way of choosing to actually go to a different place, a different state. Yes. And then other times, I will actually totally want to shift my state. I'm like, do I want to be feeling this? No, I don't want to be feeling this. I want to feel something different, right? And so sometimes it's because I actually am clear on, you know, what that emotion is. This is something old. It's an old way of being. I don't need this anymore. Like, yes, I understand that there was like a hurt small child that kind of needed, you know, to feel that way, and I can have compassion for that part of myself, and cool, you know, I don't need to feel that way. I'm just going to shift myself. You know, I know, and this is particularly something that I've shifted around some of my own collapse patterns. You know, for me, I've had quite low self-esteem, and it's had me kind of collapse in my posture, and I've noticed that, and as I've seen it more and more clearly, I'm like, I don't need to do that anymore. I don't need to be in my own sense of insecurity, and I just like keep bringing myself back to being more upright and feeling my own sense of power and confidence, worthiness, and dignity. There's also, I think, you know, contexts where it's not so useful to feel emotion. So maybe I haven't actually fully heard the message in an emotion, and it might be like really important for me to bookmark that. I'm like, there's something going on here in my being, and I don't understand why. But right now, it's not useful for me to be going into this place. It's not useful for me to collapse. You know, might be because I'm like, you know, I've got to get shit done. I'm like, you know, I'm running a workshop, or I'm coaching somebody, or I'm, you know, whatever it is, and I've got to parent my kids, and so I'm going to like purposely shift my state, knowing that I'm actually temporarily bypassing a little bit, right? Because it's not appropriate for me right now to be feeling this thing, and so I'm going to bookmark it. It is something that I'm going to want to like journal about at some point, you know, try and make some more sense of it, kind of come back to that place. But once I'm in a context where I've got the space to do it, you know, where I don't need to perform in a particular way, I can, or maybe I'm just like resourced enough to do it. I've taken enough, I'm like rested enough to kind of come back to how I'm feeling and explore what's going on there. So there's a lot in all of that, a lot. So I'm like hoping that this hasn't been too much information for people watching. It's something that's taken me a long time to even kind of have a sense of clarity around the things that I've just talked about. So it feels important for me to share these things. It's been important for me to learn them. I'm aware that there's actually still so much more. There's like a lot more complexity I could throw at you around the nature of emotion, you know, around biologically, you know, the place of it and kind of in our evolutionary trajectory. But I don't want to do too much. I think I will just say couple of final pieces. One is that, you know, historically, and I think still a lot of people see emotion as like very, very irrational. And it can be irrational in a sense. There's kind of the place of having maladaptive emotion, you know, where it's like emotion that's just not proportionate to the context at hand. You know, in a sense, I would kind of say that's irrational. But the kind of the latest neuroscience actually points to how important emotion is as part of irrationality. And this to me is really important to understand, you know, that and the kind of the research is that, you know, the examples tend to be around people who've had parts of their brains damaged that has them not feel emotion so much, you know, and they've still got the kind of cognitive capacities. And what happens for these people when they lose emotion is they can't make decisions, right? Because it's our emotional parts of us that tell us what's important to us and tell us how we're responding to things. So they're able to like kind of do all the pros and cons about different possibilities, but they get just stuck in the process of doing that. It's just like never-ending rationalization about possibilities rather than actually just being able to make a choice. So I think that's really important to understand, that emotion is actually a really fundamentally important part of how our minds work and part of how our beings work. And so that's like one piece that has me very passionate about the place of emotion. And then I think the final thing that I want to say is that I think in our culture, emotional literacy is very, very poor. And I've been teaching communication around emotions for years now. And something that really strikes me is that people basically don't have a very good emotional vocabulary. And I like encourage you to pay attention to this. So, and we say it so much in our culture, how are you feeling? What's going on for you, right? But a lot of the time, what people answer it's not actually with an emotion. They like put in some kind of evaluation instead of actually saying how they feel. Emotional words are less like, I feel happy, I feel sad, I feel a bit angry, I feel agitated, I feel open, I feel peaceful, right? Emotions kind of actually have words that you tend to have some kind of embodied awareness associated with them, at least in some kind of form. But a lot of people say, I feel like my life's not going so well, something like that, and which is, that's not an emotion, that's a judgment. And so I think it's actually really important to practice a kind of discipline of actually being aware of emotions, using feeling words, enhancing our vocabulary to speak emotion, because emotions are such a fundamentally important part of how we work. Well, then developing a vocabulary to speak our emotions, of course, has us be able to relate to them and hear the messages in them and see them a whole lot more. And this is also a piece that I'm like really, really passionate about, is like continuing constantly to enhance my own emotional literacy and teach it out in the world. Okay, I'm just going to quickly read these messages from Prem here and then sign off. Lots of stuff going on here. Yes, choice. That's like develop freedom of choice. Costs of certain behaviors. Yeah. It's hard to do the see more here. Yeah, we don't actually feel our emotions that will come out as physical pain. I think that's a really awesome point. Yeah. Emotion equals energy in motion, yes. I feel like my life's not going so well, and about that I feel totally. That's right. Can we actually, it's like fine to have judgments, but how do we feel having those judgments? Anyway, I'll read these a bit more properly when I can click the see more. Figure out how to do that later. Thank you for watching. I feel so passionate about this topic. Let me know some of your own thoughts about emotions. Good night.